Hello friends, how are you? I'm Freyja and today I'm going to talk about the Valkyries as Norns of those who died in the battlefield. The main subject of today's video is restricted to this single idea. All Valkyries are Norns, but not every Norn is a Valkyrie. So, that's the idea I'm going to develop for you today. This is, in fact, a response to a question posed by one of my patrons, Mr. Brian Campbell Hart, who asks if there is a possible connection between Frigg and the Norns. If it's possible that the Nornir are projections of Frigg, just as Valkyries are projections of Odin. So, first things first, let's talk about the relation between Frigg and Freyja, and then I shall talk about the Fylgjur, and then the Nornir, and finally the Valkyries as Norns of death. And by the middle of this video, I'll have a little surprise for you, so stick around. Well, let's start today's lesson. Alright, Frigg and Freyja. I've already done a video about that where I've presented some points that explain that these two deities might have been one and the same before Frigg, along with the cult of Odin, reached Scandinavia. But again, let's talk a bit about this. The relationship between Freyja and Frigg. These two deities have so many traits in common that it seems quite possible that originally they were one and the same goddess, even though they indisputably constitute two separate deities in the preserved mythological texts and Old Norse poetry, prose works, and the sagas. These similarities are due to a development that goes a bit on the other direction, so to speak. The cult of Freyja appears to have been limited to Scandinavia only. Frigg, on the other hand, was a prominent goddess among the continental Germanic peoples. She seems to have held a weaker position in Scandinavia, where she, above all, belonged to the world of myth and was not the subject of extensive worship. This may indicate that the traditions about Frigg spread from the continent into Scandinavia, where the goddess's similarities to Freyja were instrumental in both of them, subsequently attracting some of each other's mythological motifs. It seems clear that Frigg indeed wasn't very famous in Scandinavia, and the Scandinavian goddess who was greatly worshipped was Freyja. It also seems clear that Frigg was introduced in Scandinavia during the early Iron Age with Germanic migrations. However, we also know that on an earlier period, most likely Bronze Age, Scandinavians migrated to continental Europe. So, were Scandinavians responsible for introducing to the continental Germanics an earlier version of Freyja that became Frigg? Yes, it is quite possible indeed. We also know that on an earlier period, after the end of the last glacial period, more or less 10,000 or 11,000 years ago, southern European peoples, mostly from the Iberian Peninsula, modern France, and the Alpine regions of modern Italy and Switzerland, followed the migration of reindeer into the northern regions of Europe and into Scandinavia, and brought with them many prehistoric cults, including that of a fertility goddess of great importance, which might later on have become Freyja. Obviously not fertility related to the soils and agriculture, but a goddess of the fertility of reindeer, a prehistoric goddess worshipped by reindeer herders, so most likely a feminine reindeer spirit that later on in Scandinavia developed into a goddess. And we have, of course, the phenomenon of geni loci or genius loci, local spirits who became deities, which creates a wondrous variety of gods and goddesses. But such spiritual entities usually remain within the confinements of folklore or minor regional deities. The phenomenon of Frigg and Freya is too widespread to be the case of a genius loci. Deities whose worship spreads this much in different cultural backgrounds and survive political and religious pressure are likely to be originally, in a more remote prehistoric Proto-Indo-European past, the exact same deities. Let me give you 3 examples. We have Odin, Wodanas, Woden, Wotan, Utan, the same as the Celtic Morrigan, the Hindu Shiva and Kali, Sami Ruto, Greek Zeus, Slavic Rod, seem to be originally the same. Or Tur, Donar, Turnor, Slavic Perum, Sami Orugalis, Finnish Aja, Estonian Uko, Celtic and Lusitanian Sukelos, the Greek Roman Hercules. Or Tyr, Tiwaz, the Celtic or Gaulish Taranis, Greek Zeus again, Lusitanian Runos Cassius, German Ziu, Old Indian Dios, Roman Jupiter, Irish Dia, Slavic Devos, Lusitanian Reva, etc. You got the point already. There's no need for me to show off. But I've presented a variety of names, and they are all the same, originally 3 deities of a Proto-Indo-European background, which later on developed differently in a variety of cultural backgrounds, but still retain much of their origins. So it's possible, indeed, that Freya and Frigg were originally the same goddess, and the cults were divided. Freya to the Scandinavians and Frigg to the continental Germanic. And during the Bronze Age and Iron Age, their cults already divided, making them 2 different goddesses, came together again. But now concerning Freya and the Morrigan. Odin is closer to the figure of the Morrigan, as they both are closer to the figure of Shiva in Hindu mythology. But Freya is definitely a death goddess of magic and mystery, much like Odin and the Morrigan. Freya and Frigg seem to be the exact same deity, as previously said, so it makes sense the wife of Odin being related to more or less the same aspects of life and death that of Odin. To the southern Germanic peoples, Godin and Freya, which later on would become Odin and Freya or Frigg, were the divine couple related to destiny, which is why in many Old Norse sources we constantly see both Frigg and Freya being the wives of Odin, both being regarded as sorceresses, both related to fate, etc. But concerning Valkyries, because indeed Valkyries seem to be projections of Odin, his sort of Fylgjur. Valkyries are also related to Freya, as she is, and again this link to the Iron Age past of Godin and Freya, so thus Valkyries are projections of the wife of Odin, just like Frigg. They are the same goddess, therefore what's linked to one is linked to the other. Odin and Frigg, or Freya, being a divine couple, share the same traits and attributes. So if Freya has Valkyries, Frigg has Valkyries. But of course, with the development of mythologies and the separation of these deities in Scandinavia, certain traits are lost, or were lost. Now, Valkyriur, Valkyries, throughout the sagas always play the role of Fylgjur, but also somehow related to the Emingja. Valkyries aren't always connected to the gods, but also to people. So, in that aspect, the Valkyries were perceived as being Fylgjur, supernatural entities related to fate, and projections of someone's will and mind, or just spiritual entities that run in the family, connection to Emingja, therefore are always related to one's fate. Since they are also seen as weavers of death, battle and carnage, they are related to the raven motif as well. By itself, ravens are Fylgjur of Odin, Hugin and Munin. And this relates Odin to the Celtic Morrigan, and the same raven motif and link to death by battle or in the battlefield itself. The Norns, on the other hand, by the Norse sources obviously, it seems they weren't just three. The number 3 might have been added by Snorre Sturluson to make a comparison with the classical Greek Moirai or the Roman Parci. The 3 Norns are the divine ones, goddesses. Snorre doesn't forget about the fact that the Norns were many, not just 3, but he turned those 3 into goddesses just to compare them with the classical myths. And all the other Norns, he doesn't give them a divine attribute. He includes these Norns in the sources, but doesn't give them divinity. But the Norns indeed were many, it seems, according to the various Old Norse sources. The Norns move closer to Valkyries in their functions, as there were many concepts of Norns, some of which were even said to be the daughters of Thor in some accounts. It's possible that some Norns were actual Valkyries. Not all of them, because they seem to be spiritual entities always connected to fate, but there are different groups with different functions, but always linked to fate. So indeed, some Norns might have been Valkyries, since Valkyries choose the slain in battle and weave the tapestry of battle, death and battle carnage. So in that way, they are weaving the fate of those who are marked for death. In a way, Valkyries are Norns, the Norns of death, always related to death. All Valkyries are Norns, but not all Norns are Valkyries, because Valkyries are connected to death and to those marked for death. But many other Norns, in their functions, have nothing to do with death, but more with birth, healing, and other situations in relation to one's fate. Well, these were just a few notes, greatly summarized, because in truth, I don't want to speak much about the Fylgjur, the Valkyries, in this video, because I've already done a video about that, which you can watch in here by clicking on the information icon. I don't want to repeat myself for your own sake, but even so, I feel the need to clarify some other points. But before that, let's make a pause, because I have something for you. Hello everyone, once again. Well, let's make a little pause, because I have something to show you. So, VK&G Jewelry sent me this bracelet, which is quite simple but pretty, and I think it stays good on me. What do you think? So, this means I have 2 codes for you. Use the code ARIF30 for 30% off during the 48 hours on all arm rings starting from today, and use the code ARIF20 for 20% discount in the whole store during 15 days, also starting from today. Now, get yourself a nice bracelet such as this one, or of course any other product you might like, obviously. I think this one might prove to be quite useful as an offering to Ullr after a solemn oath. Or, of course, you can always use this piece of jewelry to show your status when the Norns of death take you. Hey, dress for the occasion, right? Alright, playtime is over. Let's get back into the classroom and continue today's lesson. So here we are, back to the subject of everything I have previously said. Well, there is a lot of things I haven't said because I don't want to repeat myself. So in the description of this video, I'll leave links to my other videos, which will help you to understand the main idea of today's video. I'll leave links for the Fylgjur video, Fylgjur, Valkyries, Frigg and Freya, etc., etc. So, the Norns are women of destiny in Nordic mythology. As I've said, Snorre Sturluson doesn't forget the existence of other Norns, but he constructs this idea of three main Norns and gives them divinity, as I said, because during the construction of his work he was very much influenced by the classical myths. But it's clear, not only from the Prose Edda, but other sources, that even among elves and dwarfs, Alfar, Dwergar, there were Norns. So Norns originally were not goddesses, but spiritual entities just like Valkyries. The Norns also represent the fateful aspect of the Disir, in which life-giving aspects are united with those of battle and death. The Disir are female entities which encompasses goddesses, Norns, Fylgjur, and other feminine spiritual entities. Much of their traits are the exact same of the Norns and Valkyries. In fact, it's actually quite hard to distinguish Nornir from Valkyriur, as they seem to be the exact same spiritual entities with the exact same functions. The only thing that makes a clear difference between Norns and Valkyries is that Valkyries are always related to battle and death in battle, to the fate of dying in the battlefield, while the Norns are also related to that sometimes, but a whole variety of other different aspects of life and death. Again, all Valkyries are Norns, but not all Norns are Valkyries. The Valkyries seem to be specifically Norns related to battle, war, carnage, death in battle. As a whole, Disir were Valkyrie-like guardians of the dead, and indeed Valkyries themselves are sometimes called Erjan's Disir, Odin's Disir. In other sources, Disir are called dead women or Fylgjur. So in conclusion, the Disir are the group of female entities related to fate and the dead, and protection, even fertility and so on. Among this group we have Valkyries, and Valkyries in their aspect of being related to a particular aspect of fate automatically causes them to enter in the group of Norns. Again, all Valkyries are Norns, but not all Norns are Valkyries, because Valkyries are exclusively related to death and battle, so just one specific aspect of fate. And not all Norns are related to death in the battlefield. Not all Norns are related to the same aspects of fate of death of the Valkyries, which means many Norns are not Valkyries. I do hope you take my meaning. The thing is, Valkyries originally were demons of death. Not in a Judeo-Christian perspective of demonology, obviously, but spiritual entities, both good and evil, always related to death. Death was solely the Valkyries' business. With the development of folklore and myth, and with the introduction of a variety of different cultural religious approaches to the cult of female entities brought into Scandinavia, Valkyries evolved and developed other traits, or rather absorbed other traits from different cults to female entities. But they never lost their connection to death. Valkyries are always related to death, and in most accounts are linked to death in the battlefield, related to violent death. Odin, in continental Germanic cultural background, was the god of death and war ecstasy. He was the god of those who died in battle, who had violent deaths, which is why he is the leader of the wild hunt, because those who ride with him are the restless dead, warriors that had violent deaths in the battlefield, and so they cannot rest. And you will understand why further ahead. When the cult of Odin was introduced into Scandinavia, the demons of death that would be called Valkyries, or become the Valkyries we know of today, were incorporated into the cult of Odin. And so the Valkyries started to be related with Odin, since both Odin and the Valkyries were related to the violent death in the battlefield. So Valkyries, as demons of death, existed in Nordic myths before the introduction of Odin in Scandinavia, which means it's quite possible, if they belong to any deity related to fate and death, most certainly that deity would be Freyja, the goddess that, aside from Odin, also takes the dead warriors. And throughout history, Freyja is always related to the cult of the dead. So, if Valkyries were related to Freyja, it means at a certain point they were also related to Frigg, since, as previously said, Frigg and Freyja were the same before Scandinavians divided them into different deities. If Valkyries are Norns, because they are related to the fate of those marked to die in battle, then the Norns can be considered as projections of spirit or spiritual entities related to Freyja or Frigg. Now, what I find, I don't want to say fascinating, but quite intriguing, is that the concept of violent death that causes restless dead is a very old concept, actually Proto-Indo-European concept. And what I'm about to say next might not be appropriate for a more sensitive audience, so if you feel like you don't want to watch anymore from this point, I completely understand. There is this very ancient belief that those who have a violent death, their spirits cannot rest, and so they are bound to the place they have died. This belief is often related to those who die in the battlefield. After a traumatic death, their spirit cannot move on or cross over, and they stay attached to the place of trauma, and their spirit remains in the place, causing them to become restless dead. According to this belief, the spirit is trying to inhabit its body again, so it cannot move on until the body disappears. Which is why necromancers would take advantage of the situation and communicate with the spirits of the dead that remained in the place of trauma, in the place of violent death. Now, what may have led to the creation of this belief was war itself. It so happens that people who have a violent death, a traumatic death, especially in war scenery, their bodies often get up and scream in terror. Let me explain. Due to the traumatic death and the amount of information passed into the brain during the final moments, the remaining electrical charges in the brain causes the brain to relieve the final moments of the traumatic death. And those electrical charges, which is what makes a body twitch on the first moments after death, are the exact same electrical charges that will cause the body to try to get up, a violent twitch, and scream in terror because of the traumatic death and the information passed into the brain at that moment. This is absolutely terrifying. It's one of the worst things someone can witness. And it so happens, after war, many of the dead, which had had a violent death, would still have these electrical charges in their brains that cause the body to twitch, even get up, at least the upper part, and scream in terror. So to the living, witnessing this moment likely caused a terrible trauma. And the idea that due to the violent death, the spirit cannot rest and remain in the place and tries to inhabit the body again. This might have been the explanation for the biological actions of the body after traumatic death. Getting up and screaming as if the spirit was trying to get into the body again. And it's precisely the moment that in Scandinavia people start to develop a more warlike culture, that the Valkyries also gain the functions of picking the dead from the battlefield and take them away into the afterlife. I think this was the religious response to the trauma of witnessing a body screaming after a violent death, and to somehow put an end to the fear that the spirit of the person would remain in the place of trauma. There seems to have been this need to transform the Valkyries into female entities that took care of those who died in the battlefield, taking care of them, appeasing their spirits and taking them into the afterlife, helping them to cross over. Certainly a romanticized idea to help dealing with the trauma of bodies rising up screaming after a violent death, and to deal with the fear of this ancestral fear of this ancestral belief that the spirit remains restless on the place of trauma. This aspect of the Valkyries was later on developed even more and highly romanticized by Richard Wagner. Originally, Valkyries were demons of death, genderless and givers of death, related to death as an aspect of fate, making them Norns of death. Alright, my dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed this video, even this last chilling part. But to take away that horrible mind image out of your head, don't forget to visit the website VKNG Jewelry, use the codes I have given you and treat yourself with some goodies. And if you found this video interesting, please do share it. That will help this channel growing. And if you like this video, please give a thumbs up. And also, if you subscribe to this channel, or if you haven't done that already and plan on doing it, please click on the bell icon so you will get all the notifications of what happens in this channel and you won't miss a thing. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag.